African Americans who had been experiencing discrimination long before the war found that conditions did not change substantially for them during the war years, many struggling with the grim irony of helping defeat racist enemy in Europe while facing the effects of racism and discrimination at home. In addition, the U.S. military itself had segregated units. Many African American workers could not find good jobs at defense plants because of their color. Those who did secure employment frequently received lower salaries than whites. Blacks who migrated to cities in search of defense jobs found housing scarce. Northern blacks, unaccustomed to Jim Crow laws, had difficulty adjusting to culture in southern industrial cities. This migration of African Americans resulted in friction between whites and blacks, which frequently boiled over into violence. In the summer of 1943, race riots erupted in 47 cities. In Detroit, riots claimed the lives of 25 blacks and 9 whites, with hundreds of persons injured. However, African Americans also looked for ways that they could ensure equality, both on the battlefield as well as at home. One of the earliest organized protests against discrimination of African Americans came in the form of the Double V campaign. Led by the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading black newspapers of the area, the campaign called for 2 victories: victory over our enemies at home and victory over our enemies on the battlefields abroad. The Courier asserted that the time had come to persuade, embarrass, compel, and shame our government and our nation into a more enlightened attitude. Courier reader James K. G. Thompson of Wichita, Kansas, had proposed the idea of a letter as soon as to the editor, while staff artist Wilbert T. Holloway designed the Double V logo. Soon, Double V clubs sprang up nationwide, and other newspapers backed the campaign editorially. After the war, the Courier continued with the Single V campaign, while the war had ended with victory over the Axis. Victory over those who discriminated against African Americans in the U.S. had yet to be realized. The bravery and valor of many African American soldiers and sailors during World War II were frequently overlooked, such as the case of Dory Miller, who distinguished himself during Pearl Harbor. Miller was serving as a cook on board the USS West Virginia when the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941. When the alarm sounded, Miller immediately reported to his battle station, but found it destroyed by a torpedo. Instead, Miller was ordered to help carry wounded soldiers to aid stations. Seeing West Virginia Captain Mervyn Benyon wounded on deck, Miller personally carried him to safety. Captain Benyon refused medical treatment and insisted on continuing his command. He bled to death during the attack. Miller then fired a .50 caliber machine gun, which he wasn't trained to use, at attacking Japanese planes. When the Japanese finally sank the West Virginia, Miller and the other sailors abandoned ship. The Navy awarded other sailors medals for valor, but initially overlooked Miller, although he eventually received the Navy Cross, the Navy's 3rd highest honor. Captain Benyon posthumously received the Medal of Honor. The Pittsburgh Courier frequently called for Miller to be allowed stateside to participate in war bond tours. The Navy awarded no African American the Medal of Honor during World War II. Only in 1997 did 7 African Americans receive the medal, 6 posthumously. Miller continued his service as mess cook, and in 1943 a Japanese torpedo hit his ship during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, sinking it in minutes. More than 200 sailors managed to escape. Miller was not one of them. Just as the 42nd Regimental Combat Team proved Japanese Americans to be skilled in combat as white troops, the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated the abilities of African Americans. The Army Corps formed an all-black unit in 1941 under congressional pressure. The War Department tried to thwart the plan by requiring that recruits either had flight experience or higher education. A large number of African Americans nonetheless met the requirements and enlisted in the program. The Army Air Force established the 99th Fighter Squadron at Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, selecting Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., one of the few black West Point graduates to command the squadron. White officer commented in a Time magazine article that the black pilots were inferior to white pilots. Following the congressional committee hearing, a subsequent evaluation of all pilots in the Mediterranean theater showed that the Tuskegee pilots to be equal or better to the other P-40 pilots. Tuskegee Airmen who escorted bombers on missions over Central Europe shot down more than 100 enemy aircraft. Many claimed for years after the war that the airmen did not lose a single plane they escorted, though later evidence proved that some bombers were lost. However, many point to the real achievement of the Tuskegee Airmen as proving that African Americans could perform just as well as whites. Native Americans also served with distinction in World War II, some of whom provided a unique and essential service, the Navajo Code Talkers. These soldiers helped to develop and transmit an unbreakable code for the American military in the Pacific Theater. Philip Johnston, the son of a Protestant missionary, came up with the idea to use Navajo after reading a newspaper story about the military search for an unbreakable code. to communicate sensitive material. The U.S. military had some success with Cherokee and Choctaw in World War I for this purpose. Johnson had spent most of his childhood around the Navajo people and knew the difficulty of learning their language. The military had some major concerns, especially how to translate modern military terminology into Navajo. The code talkers handled this problem by simply substituting Navajo words for military terms. For example, tank became a Navajo word for tortoise and airplane became bird. The Marines created an entire list of terminology for converting the Navajo language into a military use. The group of 29 code talkers in May of 1949 grew to more than 400 by 1945. They never wrote in code, so each had to memorize the system. Code talkers joined the Marine units in the Pacific and several in major battles, including Guadalcanal and two in Iwo Jima. Due to their physical resemblance to the Japanese, the code talkers were sometimes assigned guards so that they could not be confused with the enemy. In the end, the Japanese never broke the Navajo Code. 29 code talkers received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2001, and the rest were similarly honored in 2007. The shortage of wartime later, due to military service, especially in agriculture, prompted the U.S. to look outside of the country for help. The U.S. and Mexico agreed upon the Bracero Program, which in 1942 began to bring in skilled Mexican laborers, or braceros, to work as farmhands in the southwestern United States. Soon, braceros were working across the United States not only in agricultural jobs, but also alongside skilled and unskilled workers in the railroad industry. The government later instituted a quota of 5,000 agricultural workers and 75,000 for railroads. By war's end, braceros were no longer contracted for railroad service, but continued in agricultural jobs until 1964. The government closed the program amid reports of significant human rights abuses against the braceros. From its inception until 1948, braceros brought several lawsuits against the U.S. agricultural employers, mainly to recover money from savings accounts established by payroll deduction. The program had stipulated that the braceros would receive this money upon their return to Mexico, but both did not receive them. Most of the lawsuits were dismissed because the banks involved in the transactions were not located in the United States. Another example of racial discord that occurred during World War II came in the form of the Zoot Suit riots, which occurred in Los Angeles in May of 1943. The Zoot Suit riots began when U.S. sailors on leave clashed with young Hispanics. One sailor was stabbed, and soon hundreds of Marines and sailors were roaming the streets looking for anyone wearing a Zoot suit. The suit with wide lapels, baggy pants, padded shoulders, and often wide brim hat and watch chain. While mostly young Mexican Americans wore Zoot suits, so did members of other minorities such as Filipino and African Americans, who also became targets. The local press took the side of the military, calling the Zoot suiters hoodlums. Sounds a little familiar, sounds a little like Ferguson. The uproar subsided when military commanders in Los Angeles declared the city off limits to military personnel, with those violating the order subject to arrest by shore patrol officers. The service flag was commonly a way for American families to show their support for immediate family in the armed services. First known as Sons in Service flags and used during World War I, these flags were usually hung indoors in front of a window. They had a red border around with a white field, or one or more blue stars at the center, one for each family member in service. A gold star signified that a family member had died while on active duty. In 1942, several hundred women formed a Blue Star Mothers of America, a nationwide organization originally meant to provide a network of support for women and children on active duty and to preserve the government to give the promise of benefits to returning service persons. Its activities have since expanded to include volunteer work in veterans hospitals and help arrange food and shelter for disaster victims. An organization of the Mothers of Service Persons Killed in Action, Gold Star Mothers, formed after World War I for the purposes similar to Blue Star Mothers. With the outcome of the war in less doubt by late of 1944, FDR seemed to be a favorite to win the election and serve for an unprecedented fourth term of office. The Republicans nominated New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who could not defeat Roosevelt, though he did carry more states and had a higher percentage of the popular vote than previous challengers. Many Democrats concerned about liberal philosophies of Vice President Henry Wallace, decided to dump him from the ticket and replace him with a more moderate candidate. They selected Missouri Senator Harry Truman, who had become known from his work investigating waste and fraud in the defense industry. While many felt uneasy about changing vice presidents during the war, they were also greatly concerned about FDR's obviously declining health. It appeared that FDR might not live out his fourth term, and for that reason, Truman made an acceptable running mate to Wallace. The stress of being the nation's president throughout the Depression and the war ruined FDR Roosevelt's health. Suffering from hypertension as well as various other ailments, Roosevelt died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945, while staying at his presidential retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. Roosevelt was resting there in preparation for the UN conference scheduled for later that month in San Francisco. While sitting for a portrait, FDR murmured, "I have a terrific headache." He collapsed, dying a short time later. The timing of his death proved grimly ironic, in that he died only a few weeks before Adolf Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender on May 8th, which ended the war in Europe. For many Americans, FDR's death was especially painful because the length of time he served as president. Many younger Americans couldn't remember anyone else in the White House. Only hours after Roosevelt's death, Vice President Harry Truman became the nation's 33rd chief executive. While he had been a U.S. Senator for several years, he was relatively unknown for most Americans. Truman was faced with some of the biggest decisions of the war, remarking to reporters soon after his swearing in, "Boys, I don't know if you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had to happen, it felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Nevertheless, Truman soon proved up to the job. He oversaw the last months of the war and negotiated at the Potsdam Conference the post-war future for Europe. He facilitated U.S. entry into the United Nations, and one of the most important decisions of his presidency, he authorized the use of atomic weapons against Japan. As his term progressed, he also led the country through the beginning of the Cold War, including the Berlin Crisis and the Korean War. He also was responsible for picking and using the nuclear bomb. Albert Einstein contacted the U.S. about efforts in Germany in 1939 to purify uranium-235. The U.S. government gets him out and then begins the Manhattan Project shortly after there to produce a viable atomic weapon. Over the course of 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, $2 billion was spent on the Manhattan Project. The first bomb to be dropped was on Hiroshima. It was a uranium bomb called Little Boy, despite weighing over 4.5 tons, and it was dropped on August 6th of 1945, dropped from the airplane the Enola Gay. Pretty much immediately, 69,000 people were injured, and part of the rationale for dropping the bomb was that it would cause less casualties than an actual land invasion of Japan. Total vaporization from the bomb was within a half-mile diameter. Total destruction, severe blast damage went as far as 2 miles, and everything flammable burned within 2.5 miles. Hoping that the Japanese would surrender, we said we'll do it again. If you don't surrender, they didn't surrender. So on August 9th, 1945, the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, which was, these two cities were big wartime industrial cities. And this one was called Fat Man and was a plutonium bomb. It still leveled nearly half the city, and 25,000 people were injured and lots of people were killed. A few weeks after Roosevelt's death, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker under the streets of Berlin. And with the Soviet army closing in on the city, Germany finally surrendered on May 6th and 7th, 1945. With the surrender of Germany, all we had left to do was win the Pacific Theater. In 1945, August of 1945, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki convinced the Japanese to surrender without an Allied invasion. Nearly 6 years after World War II began in Europe, the Japanese formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, ending the war. Americans across the nation celebrated the end of the war, though many had serious concerns. In some instances, families anxiously awaited information about loved ones listed as missing in action, and others were dealing with deaths in their family. Still others saw an uncertain future, with so many servicemen looking for jobs and wanting to start families and further their education. The end. The GI Bill. You guys can just write those notes because I'm running out of time. And have a good weekend.